Questions being raised tonight about an unprecedented message to the military's top brass. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth outlining his vision to reshape the military, and President Trump suggesting they use, quote, dangerous American cities as training grounds for the military.
The United States has long prided itself on being a fortress of democracy, protected from outside threats by its military strength and global influence. But in a fiery and unsettling address to top military leaders, former President Donald Trump warned that America's gravest danger may not come from abroad, but from the enemy within. His words echoed through the halls like a battle cry, igniting debates about loyalty, national security, and the future of civil-military relations. Was this speech a bold call to vigilance or a dangerous escalation of rhetoric aimed at reshaping power within the United States itself? To supporters, Trump is speaking a hard truth that others fear to admit. To critics, his words represent an alarming attempt to weaponize the military against political rivals. Whatever the interpretation, one thing is clear: Trump has thrown down a gauntlet, and the consequences could ripple far beyond Washington. Let's break it all down. Chapter 1. Trump's fiery speech. The stage was set in front of the nation's top brass. Generals, admirals, and defense officials gathered to hear from the former commander-in-chief. Instead of delivering a message of unity or strategic policy, Trump issued a stark warning. America, he claimed, faces betrayal from within its own ranks of leadership, media, and government institutions. This nation cannot survive if its enemies are allowed to operate freely inside our borders, Trump declared. And make no mistake, some of those enemies are not foreign at all. The words landed with thunder. For some, they evoked the ghost of past eras: McCarthyism, the Red Scare, and Cold War suspicion. For others, it was the blunt, unapologetic Trump they had come to expect. But no matter the perspective, the statement marked a sharp escalation in Trump's combative rhetoric, especially when delivered directly to the nation's military leadership. Chapter 2. The enemy within rhetoric. The phrase enemy within has deep historical resonance. It conjures images of subversion, infiltration, and betrayal. By using it, Trump was not just warning about threats, he was framing political conflict as an internal war. Critics argue that this language risked blurring the line between dissent and treason. Who qualifies as the enemy? Political opponents? Government officials who resist Trump's agenda? Journalists who challenge his narratives? Supporters, however, claim the message is overdue. They see Trump as exposing a hidden network of elites, bureaucrats, and power brokers who allegedly undermine the will of the people. In their eyes, the enemy within is not an abstraction. It is the so-called deep state, and Trump is the only leader willing to confront it head-on. The power of rhetoric lies not only in what is said, but in how it reshapes the battlefield of ideas. And with this speech, Trump effectively declared that battlefield to be domestic. Chapter 3. Military leaders in the spotlight. What makes Trump's remarks especially explosive is his chosen audience: the U.S. military. Since the founding of the Republic, American tradition has insisted on the apolitical role of the armed forces. Generals swear allegiance not to a party, but to the Constitution. By telling military leaders to beware of an enemy within, Trump placed them in the uncomfortable position of interpreting his meaning. Was he urging vigilance against espionage and corruption within the ranks? Or was he hinting that the military must play a role in domestic politics, something most officers dread? For some leaders, the message sounded like a loyalty test. Would the military side with Trump's definition of the people against his definition of the enemy? Or would they stand firmly on neutral ground, resisting pressure from any political figure? The military's silence and response spoke volumes. Chapter 4. A history of Trump versus the Pentagon. Trump's rocky relationship with military leadership is no secret. From clashes with generals over strategy in Afghanistan, to public disputes with Defense Secretary James Mattis, Trump has often portrayed himself as a lone warrior battling entrenched defense elites. During his presidency, he frequently accused Pentagon officials of being more loyal to defense contractors than to the American people. He suggested that military leaders resisted his calls to bring troops home because they wanted to keep wars going to make money. Now, by reviving the rhetoric of betrayal, Trump is returning to familiar ground. His message frames him as the outsider, willing to confront a system that, even at its highest levels, he claims cannot be trusted. But history shows that when political leaders declare internal enemies, the risks to democracy grow exponentially. Chapter 5: National Security and Loyalty Tests. At the core of Trump's warning lies a critical question. How should national security institutions respond to the idea of an enemy within? Intelligence agencies already monitor domestic extremism, cyber infiltration, and espionage. But Trump's definition seems broader, more political than operational. This raises alarms. If the concept of internal enemies becomes politicized, it risks turning loyalty tests into a weapon. Could government employees be branded disloyal for disagreeing with a leader? Could journalists be accused of treason for publishing critical stories? In authoritarian systems, this is the slippery slope to repression. Yet Trump's supporters argue that ignoring corruption and betrayal is far more dangerous. That rooting out disloyalty is essential to survival. It is a collision between two visions of national security, one rooted in institutional neutrality, and the other rooted in personal loyalty. Chapter 6: Political Enemies or Internal Threats. The ambiguity in Trump's speech was not accidental. By leaving the term enemy within undefined, he allowed listeners to project their own fears and suspicions onto it. For MAGA loyalists, the enemy is the establishment, career bureaucrats, liberal judges, or political elites who resist Trump's vision. For moderates, it could mean foreign infiltration, spies, hackers, or cartels operating inside U.S. borders. For critics, it could mean that Trump is labeling his political opposition as enemies of the state. This kind of strategic ambiguity can be powerful. It mobilizes supporters while keeping critics off balance. But it also inflames divisions, ensuring that the label of enemy falls differently depending on who is speaking and who is listening. Chapter 7: Media, Messaging, and Public Opinion. Within hours of Trump's remarks, the media landscape erupted. Right-leaning outlets praised his courage for speaking uncomfortable truths. Left-leaning commentators warned of authoritarian undertones. Social media amplified the message further with hashtags like enemy within trending across platforms. Supporters shared memes framing Trump as a modern-day warrior exposing corruption. Opponents compared the speech to dangerous precedents from history, leaders who weaponized fear to consolidate power. Public opinion polls reveal a nation split. Roughly half of Republicans agree with Trump's assessment that internal enemies pose a greater danger than foreign powers. Among Democrats and independents, however, the majority view his words as reckless and destabilizing. Once again, Trump has proven his mastery of media cycles. Dominate the conversation, frame the terms, and force everyone to react. Chapter 8: Allies Abroad, Watching Closely. While the speech was directed at a domestic audience, its reverberations were felt globally. Allies in Europe and Asia expressed quiet concern. For nations that rely on America's stability, the sight of a former president warning of enemies within raised fears of internal fracture. Foreign adversaries, meanwhile, saw opportunity. Russian and Chinese state media highlighted Trump's remarks as evidence of U.S. weakness and division. Even their own leaders admit America is crumbling from within, one commentator declared on Chinese television. The speech, then, was not just about domestic politics. It was a signal to the world. The United States is engaged in a struggle not only against external rivals, but against itself. Chapter 9: Legal, constitutional, and ethical questions. Trump's rhetoric also raises profound constitutional questions. Can a former president, still a candidate, address military leaders in terms that imply political loyalty? Does this blur the sacred principle of civilian control of the military? Ethicists warn that encouraging the armed forces to see internal political actors as enemies risks eroding the firewall that separates democracy from authoritarianism. If the military is ever politicized, the very foundation of the republic could crack. Legal scholars point out that while free speech protects Trump's words, the impact of those words could be tested in court if they are ever seen as incitement. For now, the battlefield remains rhetorical, but the line between rhetoric and action is often thinner than it seems. Chapter 10. Election Stakes and the Battle Ahead. Ultimately, Trump's speech must be seen through the lens of the looming election. By framing his campaign as a fight against the enemy within, he transforms politics into existential warfare. For his supporters, this framing justifies extraordinary measures. For his critics, it confirms fears that a second Trump presidency would escalate domestic conflict. The military's role, whether as passive observers or pressured participants, will remain one of the most closely watched dynamics of the coming months. What makes this story so disturbing isn't just the crime, it's the violation of safety. The family's home, a place meant to be a sanctuary, had been invaded in the most intimate way. And unlike the first call, this wasn't the aftermath of violence. It was terror unfolding in real time while the caller was still face-to-face with danger. 2 calls. One from the aftermath of tragedy, the other from the middle of a nightmare. The first reveals the desperate sound of a friend trying to save a life. The second shows the chilling terror of discovering that danger was already inside your home. These calls remind us that fear takes many forms. The silence after a life is lost, or the whisper of disbelief when a hidden threat is suddenly revealed. Thank you for watching the Hollow Broadcast series. If you found this story compelling, please subscribe, leave a comment, and share your thoughts. And remember, sometimes the scariest stories are not fiction, they're real.